No matter how many times Disney decides to remake it, the story of Pinocchio will never not be creepy. We all know Pinocchio as the puppet who wanted to be a real boy, but the original story is horrifying. In the 1840s, an Italian man named Giovanni Francesco Aldini created a puppet named Pinocchio. The puppet was based on a character from a popular Italian children's story about a wooden puppet who comes to life. Aldini performed with the puppet for decades, delighting audiences with its lifelike movements, but while the puppet was loved by all, the story it was based on was anything but heartwarming. Written by Carlo Collodi, the story follows a poor woodcarver who makes a living by carving animals out of wood. One day he decides to carve a puppet, and as he is making it, a blue fairy appears and brings the puppet to life. She warns the puppet, who is named Pinocchio, that if he proves himself to be brave, truthful and unselfish, he can become a real boy. Pinocchio, however, is too disobedient and irresponsible to listen and spends most of the story causing trouble and getting into danger. Eventually, the blue fairy loses patience and Pinocchio is left as a puppet forever. In the 1883 novel, Pinocchio wasn't a sweet child. He was cruel, violent, and even murdered his talking cricket. If you think that plot sounds dark, it gets worse. In the original story, Pinocchio isn't the innocent puppet we know and love today. He's actually a manipulative, mischievous, and downright terrifying puppet who murders his own guardian. You heard that right. In the story, Pinocchio is given a talking cricket as a gift, which is supposed to help guide him and keep him out of trouble. But Pinocchio quickly becomes annoyed by the cricket's constant chatter and he eventually snaps, grabs his hammer and smashes the cricket to death. This is far from the only time Pinocchio displays extreme violence in the story. At one point, he attends a school run by a kindly old woman, but he quickly becomes bored and disobedient. When the old woman tries to punish him, Pinocchio grabs a nearby axe and chops her to pieces. Needless to say, this version of Pinocchio is not your average Disney protagonist. The story ends not with a happy transformation, but with Pinocchio being hanged from a tree. As we all know, Disney's version of Pinocchio ends with Pinocchio becoming a real boy after proving himself to be brave, truthful, and unselfish. However, the original story has a much darker ending. Pinocchio is never transformed into a real boy and instead is hanged from a tree like the puppet he always was. Throughout the story, Pinocchio is constantly trying to escape his fate as a puppet, but in the end, he is unable to change his destiny. After committing countless atrocities, Pinocchio is finally captured and hanged, leaving the reader with a disturbing message. No matter how hard you try, you can't escape your fate. The tale was meant to terrify children into obedience, not inspire them. So why was such a dark story written in the first place? Well, the author, Carlo Collodi, wrote the story as a cautionary tale to scare children into behaving themselves. The story of Pinocchio was published in 1883 and set in a time when children were expected to be seen and not heard. They were also expected to be extremely obedient and never question their elders. Collodi's story is a dark reflection of the society in which it was written, a time when children who misbehaved were often punished severely. Pinocchio's horrific fate serves as a warning to children to always listen to their parents and never do anything that might bring them shame. And while this may seem extreme, it was actually quite common for children's stories during this time period. Stories like Little Red Riding Hood and Hansel and Gretel were also meant to scare children into good behavior. Disney cleaned it up, but the real Pinocchio was born from fear, not magic. Today, we remember Pinocchio as a beloved Disney character whose nose grew when he told lies. This iconic character has become synonymous with childhood innocence and wonder. But what many people do not realize is that the real Pinocchio was a much darker character whose story was meant to scare children into obedience. When Disney adapted the Pinocchio story for their movie, they obviously cleaned it up a bit. They made Pinocchio a sweet and innocent puppet who learns valuable lessons throughout his journey. They also gave him a happy ending where he is finally transformed into a real boy after proving himself to be brave, truthful, and unselfish. While the original story is dark and disturbing, Disney's version is a beloved classic that has brought joy to generations of children. So next time you watch the movie, just remember that the real Pinocchio was a much different character than the one we know and love today.